Hello there. This is Codie Sanchez here. Hey everyone at Arcview. It's so exciting to get to see you all again in your living rooms. I'm Codie Sanchez of Entourage Effective Capital. We're a cannabis growth equity firm in the investment space in cannabis, if I don't know you already. So I'm thrilled to be here talking to you all about the industry today that we, if you're here, might think of too as the next generational wealth creation event. If you don't know Arcview, we are the largest group of high net worth investors in cannabis. And our goal is really to bring you everything you need to invest in this fast-paced industry that really demands a lot of respect and that you take education seriously. And so today I think is a really special one because today we're going to talk about going global. And that's near and dear to my heart as I used to run a couple multi-billion-dollar asset management businesses in Latin America. And so these emerging markets, I think, are really interesting for anyone who wants to make startup investing, but certainly in this wild world of cannabis that we have. So today, the one thing I'm going to do a little bit different than other times is we're going to have some experts come on the line today, and I'm going to introduce you to them. But these experts are going to talk to you about the benefits of investing internationally in cannabis. And I am going to play the contrarian today. What I'm going to do is talk to you about all the things I would think about first as an investor before I jumped into international markets. I'm hopefully going to give you a few moments of pause and maybe some hard questions to throw on the panelists instead of me, because I'm not going to be on that segment. So let's start. I have 4 that I want you all to consider really quickly before I introduce our panelists. First, I remember well when I was doing some business dealings in Brazil a few years ago now, there was a quote that one of my Brazilian colleagues told me in Portuguese, which in English roughly translates to something like, Brazil is for the Brazilians. And what they meant by that quote was that if you did not have a contact in Brazil that you trusted implicitly, that you almost could, give your firstborn child to for a couple of weeks and know that it would be fine, you weren't going to make it in their market, was their opinion to me. And there was a lot of reasons for them saying that. One of which was that, in my business finance at the time, we couldn't even own 51% of our enterprise. That in fact, we had to have a local contact that owned 51% who was a Brazilian national. And so there are these unique aspects to doing business that overlaid on top of the fact that the industry was hard as is. My piece of advice to you there would be most namely, check out how the structures have to work in these emerging markets. Is there an ability for these countries to nationalize in any aspect of the business? Who actually is the owner of the underlying business? Do you have to have some of these, intricate ownership structures that will mean it'll be harder for you to exit and sell out of your business? Number 2, geopolitical risks. So political risks, as we know as cannabis investors, is already one of the most difficult parts to handicap in this business. We are nothing if not taking sort of regulatory arbitrage with every investment we make in cannabis. Now you have to add a layer on top of that of the individual international markets. And do you understand what's going to happen in, let's say, Mexico? If you guys are familiar with AMLO in that market, that is a trade that I would be hesitant to make right now. He's nationalized a few businesses, but simultaneously, he's also opened up a lot of trade with the US. So there's this unique dynamic that I really think you've got to understand your political risk deeply in any country and have some local contacts to help you do that. The third part is exporting cannabis out of international markets or emerging markets and into developed markets. This is a pitch I've heard hundreds of times from many entrepreneurs. There's a couple sneaky things you got to be careful about. One, people are going to say something like, which makes sense to me long term, Colombia is going to be the predominant cultivator of cannabis in Latin America, and they will export that to the world. They do it with lots of other flowers. Why can't they do it with another tropical plant like cannabis? It's a great point, except for one thing I would have you think about. If you look at the world around you today, what do we see everywhere? Borders are closing. People are nationalizing. There's a lot of focus on individual countries as opposed to our global politic. Now, whether you think that's right or wrong, it appears to just be. And so my belief is that we will not be having massive exportation anytime soon. Long term for sure, but short term, no. So when people tell you that they're an exporter to Germany, make sure to ask at what level. How many pounds? How many tons? My guess is you're typically going to find that those exporters are exporting ounces, grams, maybe pounds, and it's mostly for research and testing as opposed to actually doing providing of cannabis to that other market. The next one, this is kind of interesting. I'll show you a slide that I thought was fascinating. And this slide does something that everybody does when they talk about cannabis. They show you the top line figures in an industry. Now, I keep picking on my favorite land of Latin America because I know it better than most markets. And there are experts on here that know other markets such as Saul with Israel, et cetera, much better than I. But what do you notice if you look at this slide? What you should notice is there's one word in pretty much any regards that's related to cannabis, and that's estimated. Nowhere on here do they typically talk about the actual dollar size of the industry. And the reason why they don't do that is because that dollar size of the industry is tiny. So people will say with Latin America that's going to be a $9.8 billion or a $10 billion industry. But if you ask, okay, but how much has been sold legally in cannabis to date? You're going to hear millions, not even really tens of millions yet, but millions of dollars in sales. So you just have to make sure that when you're looking at the space, you truly understand where the market is at today, as opposed to where do we think it's going to be in 20 years. And that is a big component of it. That is how a lot of people got in trouble, like Canopy Growth, divesting international assets by seeing the future come faster than it really is going to. And lastly, a lot of people talk about cannabis in emerging markets on the fact that you can cultivate at a much cheaper level. And that is true. You know, in fact, people say in Latin America, the average, cost of the lowest priced cannabis could be something like 50 cents a gram. And that's pretty phenomenal. But the question becomes a couplefold. One, how are you measuring that? Two, is it scalable? Three, is it actually GMP certified? Four, can you really export it? And five, do you understand the geopolitical risk? So my biggest push for cannabis investors is we have a huge opportunity in this industry, but you have to pair the opportunity with actually the right timing. I think in the short term, emerging markets and international markets are not the most accretive bet, except maybe Europe, purely my opinion. Shared by some of my partners at EEC. But long term, I think these markets will be sizable and will likely dwarf the size of the US, given all of the numbers of consumers that we can have therein. So with that, love to have the other individuals combat me on this and have a little bit of constructive debate. But keep that contrarian hat on as you hear anything outside of the US, because while the reward may be great, I would argue the risk is always greater if you are here in the US and that is your home base. Okay, let me give a couple shout outs. First, I want to thank our sponsor, Green Tank Technologies. We can't do these without sponsors like this. Turns out Arcview is very good at getting sponsors that give you benefits. So let me tell you some of them. I always like a good discount or free thing. I don't know about you. So Green Tank believes great extracts need great hardware. Seems reasonable to me. Designed in North America, they develop and manufacture innovative, high-performance vape technology exclusive to cannabis. So they provide licensed producers and extractors with top-of-the-line vape tech engineered specifically for each brand's extract formulations. Since you all like discounts, as a special thank you, Green Tank is running a 10% discount to anyone watching, listening on their first Green Tank order. It's valid until the end of the summer, that 10% off, and you can email sales@greentanktech.com. Sales@greentanktech. I think they'll throw that in the comments to my Arcview brethren. Let me introduce the speakers that are hopefully going to punch a bunch of holes in my negative Nancy commentary I just gave you. First, we'll start with Saul Kaye. Saul has worked in cannabis for the past 5 years, and I've known Saul, you for a few of them, and been able to share a stage with you, which is fun. He began his career over 20 years ago as a retail pharmacist. Today, he manages multiple retail and online pharmacy stores with global distribution and has founded and operated a number of other businesses. He travels the world to educate and promote Israel's medical cannabis expertise, which is impressive. Certainly a lot of interesting biotech and research going on in Israel. He founded iCAN, Israel Cannabis, in 2015 with the vision to build and develop the cannabis ecosystem in Israel, and also hosts Canatech global events. If you haven't checked out those yet. Then we've got Steve DeAngelo. I think everybody here probably knows Steve. Steve, I don't use the word pioneering often, but he certainly is one. A pioneer in cannabis entrepreneurship, activism. He's an author. If you haven't read his book yet, it was one of the first ones I read in the industry, called The Cannabis Manifesto, and an on-screen personality, as you're about to find out. He co-founded several iconic cannabis businesses, including Harborside, one of the first 6 dispensaries licensed in the US, also the first to have a drive-through. Steep Hill Laboratory, first dedicated cannabis lab, the Arcview Group, sounds familiar, and the National Cannabis Industry Association, the industry's first trade association. Then we have John Kagia, and John is a thought leader in the cannabis industry as well. And basically what John does with New Frontier Data is he develops forecasts for the growth of the industry, giving you insights into the cannabis consumer and analysis into the global cannabis demand globally. I definitely have used many of their reports, so thank you for putting those together. John sort of works with investors, business owners, and operators to understand this industry, and he's going to give you some tools to hedge risks, capitalize on opportunities, and maybe make some good bets in cannabis with Arcview. With that, let me hand it over, and thank you all so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Codie. Really appreciate it. Some great insight, because now is a great time to invest in an industry that's proven to be a little bit resistant to, I don't know if we're in a depression yet, but at least resistant. But before we jump into the investment side, I think it's really important from an international standpoint to frame where the world is, where the opportunities are, and what's happening. And I think, Steve, you're more traveled than I am even in the industry. And I think you were in 8 countries at least last year. Before we get to regulation and opportunity, how does the culture, the cannabis culture of a country, affect where it's going to end up in its regulation? And I think that's important for investors to know as well.
I'd be happy to answer that, Saul. I had a great time last year. I did travel to 8 different countries, 4 different continents. And, you know, I think that not only is cannabis culture important to understand, but understanding the history and culture of the country that you're in is also really important, apart from the cannabis culture. So I think that I think about 3 countries that we can compare and contrast. One is Jamaica. Jamaica, of course, has a very, very deep cannabis culture, the Rastafarian culture. And even though that culture has been marginalized in Jamaica for many, many years, it's also brought the island a great deal of international recognition, a great deal of tourism, a great deal of pop music, stardom. And so there is a general recognition amongst the Jamaican populace that Rastafarianism is a legitimate culture, that the use of cannabis is connected to a particularly spiritually oriented lifestyle. And that's considered to be pretty much completely legitimate by most Jamaicans. And what you saw in regulation in Jamaica was that without a huge amount of organization on the part of the Rastafarian community relative to what we've seen in other countries, they were able to secure a sacramental licensing category, which allows Rastafarians to grow an unlimited amount of cannabis, to use an unlimited amount of cannabis, and to trade that cannabis on a non-monetary basis, basically in an unlimited fashion. That's really unique from anything that I've seen anywhere around the world. And I think that it's a testament to what can happen when there is a deep-seated cannabis culture, where you have multiple generations of people who have grown up using this plant, and their value system has been informed by it. Then I would take a look at Colombia and Mexico very quickly, because I think they're interesting contrasts. And here I'm thinking really more about the underlying history and culture of these 2 countries. In both places, following the invasion of the Spanish, highly European elites, urbanized elites, took control of most of the political and business development of the country. Many people, indigenous people and poor campesinos, poor farmers, were marginalized in the countryside. And so you had a dichotomy. You had these very wealthy, urbanized, powerful elites in the cities, and then you had a countryside that was relatively disempowered and not always fully connected to the national economy. In Mexico, this led to the Mexican Revolution in 1910, and you had leaders like Emiliano Zapata who pushed for tierra y libertad, land and liberty. And the result was that in Mexico, over the course of the last 100 years, you've seen the creation and integration of a very robust sector of campesinos, small farmer, agricultural support systems, activist organizations, collectives, and the same thing on the indigenous side to a lesser degree. In Colombia, it's different. That war is really still being fought. As I traveled through the Colombian countryside, what I saw was, active violence continuing to go on between the countryside and the army that was sent in from the cities. And so the result in terms of regulation has been that in Colombia, the regulations from my point of view have really been tailored to the interests of that elite. It's mainly a classical extraction of resources and exporting kind of economy that's envisioned in Colombia. In Mexico, there's a much more robust kind of cannabis economy that's being envisioned with a lot more players along the supply chain. And the campesinos, the small farmers, have actually won a special right to be the only vertically integrated organizations, entities that are going to be allowed in Mexico. Whereas in Colombia, the campesinos are basically relegated to supplying a maximum of 10% of the cannabis that's going to be exported from the country. So all of these things play out, both the approach to cannabis, the culture of the cannabis, but also the existing political and cultural dynamics in the country. And they all have an effect on regulation. It's really important to take a deep dive and get to know the country that you're in before you think about deploying serious money.
I agree. As Israel looks to legalize now, we've gone through in the last few weeks a serious change in the regulators' approach. But we're on the flip side now the largest importer of cannabis in the world. And Codie mentioned before, we're not talking massive amounts. This is 6 tons of cannabis. That's probably, Steve's daily supply in Harborside. But if you look at those sort of dynamics, John, where does low-cost worldwide supply come into the value chain when we're so geo-fenced at the moment? And then how does it play out in places like where you are? I think you're in Kenya right now. Just dive into the global opportunity from a low-cost perspective, and then maybe an answer to Codie's question of, is this a real business yet internationally, or should we all just be in California?
Thanks very much, Saul. And I couldn't agree more with the framing that Steve laid this out with in terms of the importance of understanding the local market, because that not only influences the ability to activate those markets, but the ability to get product out of those markets into the international ecosystem. So really important question about this idea of the emergence of a global cannabis economy. And maybe just first as context, based on our modeling, based on New Frontier Data's modeling, we estimate that globally there are a little over 260 million regular cannabis consumers who are collectively spending roughly $350 billion a year on cannabis. So this is a massive existing consumer market. But there's huge asymmetry between how much is being spent and consumed territorially. And Saul, to your point, because we are still so geofenced, there's huge misalignment between some of these low-cost producer economies where they've seen the opportunity that cannabis will represent, and they're moving quite aggressively to try and activate markets, activate industries in those markets. And the international side, where they're trying to export the markets into, where the markets just aren't primed to absorb the quantity of product being produced. So the 6,000 to 8,000 pounds that we're talking about importing being imported into Israel. By contrast, Colorado, which is a state that has roughly 80,000 registered medical patients, sold 118,000 pounds of medical cannabis. So the quantities being imported into Israel, even as Israel is now the world's largest importer, are minuscule relative to what you would see in a fully functional, fully operational medical market like Colorado. And so while countries from Latin America, I think Colombia is a great example. They've had over 4,000 applications to produce. They've issued more than a couple of hundred licenses now, and that market is trying to get active. But the target markets which people were hoping to get product into in a robust way, Israel, Germany, Australia, just yet don't have the ingestion capacity to absorb these products, even though they are being produced at a fraction of the cost of what they're being produced for in these Western markets. So if it's costing in Canada, $3 to $5 per gram, and that number is dropping, but $3 to $5 per gram by the licensed producers, and you can produce an equivalent for that, depending on which market you look at. We know people in Thailand who are talking about getting the costs to 7 cents. The cost delta between the low-cost countries and the developed markets is substantial, but the concern and the destabilization in this market is the asymmetry between how much is being produced in these developing economies, how much capacity is being developed to produce in these developing economies, and the ability for the Western markets, whether that's in Germany and in Australia, in other parts of the EU, the ability to absorb this product, because patient registrations aren't growing as quickly. The regulations are strict, which limit how efficiently you can build these programs, and the progress toward adult use legalization has been slow. Further, you add GMP certification as a prerequisite to get product into many of these European markets. And these lesser developed nations who face challenges with developing that level of kind of robust technological infrastructure, it adds cost, it adds complexity, and it adds time to get these systems going.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of what happened in Israel. We're importing when we should be a net exporter because the supply chain has regulatory bottlenecks that prevent it from opening at the pace that it needs to get to for the patient side. Which I guess kind of leads me to Steve, and it's back to what you said, John, about Colorado. How does medicinal cannabis and recreational cannabis look in Europe and Israel and outside of the US in the coming years, and how do they intersect?
Well, I think that medical cannabis in the United States is unique for a number of reasons. Number one, we don't have any kind of public health care system here versus Europe, where most of Europe does have that health care system. You also have the federal state split in the United States, so there's not national policy like there is in Europe and in Israel and other countries. And you have this very interesting situation as a result of that in the United States, where there's pre-existing medical cannabis regulations in states before federal regulations have even been issued. So, one of the interesting investment opportunities that I haven't seen explored yet is that the state of California and other states allow the making of health claims on medical cannabis products at a much lower threshold than federal law would if federal law allowed it, which presently it pretty much does not allow. So when you take
in California.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's fairly easy to make health claims on medical cannabis products in the state of California relative to what would be required at the federal level. Thus far, nobody's done that in the state of California, but it's something that's available. But to the greater point, all of these factors are going to make the medical cannabis in the United States quite different from the way that it is in other countries. And so in Europe, where you have public health, where you have a national policy, I think that you're going to see a much more rapid, you're already seeing a more rapid adoption of cannabis into the mainstream health system. And that really hasn't happened fully in the United States yet. And so that's going to be a difference that I think plays out into the future. One of the things that I get concerned about is that because of the freedom that this state-by-state approach has given us, and the relatively weak regulation has given us with medical cannabis in California, or excuse me, in the United States, we've been able to focus a lot on whole plant medicine and develop a lot of products that are based on a whole plant medicine approach. In Europe, of course, what we're seeing is that because cannabis is going much more quickly into the formal medical system, it's also much more, to a much greater degree, being put into pharmaceuticalized preparations. So Europe is really accelerating the pharmaceuticalization of Europe, I think. And in the United States, we still have in many states a sort of a bastion of whole plant medicine that's in these state regulated medical cannabis systems. So it's vastly different. And I think that seeing how this plays out in the future as the United States adopts a national policy, and how these different state policies are reconciled with it is going to be a place that investors should pay attention to.
Yeah, I agree. And from that, in Israel, there is a medical cannabis device called the Psyche. It's a metered dose cannabis device that's pharmaceutical, more than whole plant, and it sells for $400 a month for a unit that is covered then by insurance. And that tends to a different game, which is, the total medicalization as opposed to the recreationalization, or the adult use side, can tell us a lot of what's going to happen. And maybe for John, as we see the product set emerging from Colorado, California, does that follow into Europe as well? Can we take those lessons that we're learning, or is this, going to be played out differently in different countries?
I think Steve is dead on. There is going to be quite a bit of variance between how the ecosystem has evolved in the US and what we're seeing in Europe. So the state-based model in the US has created an environment for hyper-innovation. So you have 33 medical markets, all geo-fenced, tons of producers in each of those markets. And because it's quite difficult to get product transferred between US states, within each state, you have almost this environment of hyper-competitive, hyper-innovative companies, all trying to create new and novel ways to deliver consumer experiences. And most of those experiences being delivered through whole plant extracts, whether that's flower or whole plant products, whether that's flower for combustion or whole plant-based oils and concentrates. The challenge or difference that we're going to see, and it's already emerging in Europe, is take, for example, the EU's designation of CBD as a novel food. And what that has done to destabilize the CBD environment in terms of the requirement that you can prove the safety and efficacy of CBD before it can be permitted for ingestibles. That creates the UK is the first market to move really aggressively in this arena. It has said that by March 2021, all CBD products that are selling ingestibles will have to meet this Food Standards Agency's novel food requirements by submitting paperwork that demonstrates efficacy. And thus far, we only know of one company that's been able to do that. That kind of requirement that you have to not only prove the safety profile of these products, but because of the science required to do it, means that you're now dealing with isolates, single molecule products rather than whole plant products, creates a kind of massive disruption to the environment. It means that even though in the US, there's a whole body of work that shows, generally speaking, cannabis in its whole plant form does have a very broadly speaking, safe kind of profile. The requirement of the novel food designation makes that nigh impossible to affirm. If there's hundreds of molecules in cannabis and some of them we haven't even discovered yet, or we don't understand how they work, meeting that safety profile threshold becomes much more difficult. So one of the things I think we're going to see as a consequence of this is a much slower deployment of ingestibles in Europe because of that requirement, to a much stronger leaning toward pharmaceuticalization, kind of strict dosing-based approach to medical cannabis. And third, I think it actually then raises a really interesting tension as popular support for full legalization grows across Europe, and it is growing quickly. Reconciling this idea that the medical community is rallying behind a more deeply medically oriented approach to cannabis delivery, whereas now the public who have been consuming this at significant rates, we have nearly 40% of adults in Europe who have consumed cannabis in the past and would be interested in consuming it again in the future. As momentum builds for the recreational legalization, how to reconcile what legalization might look in recreational form, given some of the strict parameters by which the medical market is bounded. That's not been an issue in the US because, broadly speaking, the types of products that are available in med and rec markets are very similar, and there's been broad acceptance of both. But I think the leaning toward a more pharmaceutical approach on the medical side in Europe and in other countries might lead to a more complex regulatory environment as the markets try to transition to an adult use environment.
100%. And from an investment perspective, I guess, Steve, following on from that, how do the black markets, the illicit markets, develop into the real markets when you look at Europe going isolate and novel food? That means there's a huge opportunity on the side of the non-isolate novel food. And we can't really ignore that. And that's sort of where I see the puck going in 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I think that John is outlining the same kind of dynamic that you are, right? And what I've seen is that if you create a regulatory system that does not effectively provide consumers the type of cannabis products that they want through regulated channels, they will non-regulated channels will develop to supply that demand. And so everywhere I went, all around the world, I had small producers coming up to me, mostly gray market people in places like Spain, Colombia, Mexico, who were giving me a whole different variety of cannabis ingestibles, various different new kinds of extracts, all sorts of new inventions that they were pressing into my hands. And to the degree that the European system or anybody's system doesn't make room for that kind of innovation to take place in regulated channels, it's just going to lead to a continuation of the underground market.
Yeah. And then how do you involve the political movements in this? You're involved in many political movements, and the one that I know the most about is the Last Prisoner Project, but also now Radio Free Cannabis. I'm about to approach, I hope to sit on the committee in Israel for legalization, because they're making some critical mistakes that they shouldn't be making at this point, and leaving out the current industry, leaving out the patients, leaving out the activists, and that, typically leads to getting it wrong. So what, political movements should we be following and listening to?
Well, there's, in general, as my earlier comments suggested, I think that it's really important to understand the overall political dynamics in a country. And since cannabis is generally grown in the countryside, and at least traditional cannabis, it's important to have an understanding of the dynamics of what's going on in the countryside. One of the very interesting things that I saw is that because indigenous people and cannabis have both been pushed into remote, inaccessible areas, they have had necessarily, most indigenous tribes have had some kind of relationship with cannabis, and it's gone in different directions. Some, like the Nasa in Colombia, have embraced cannabis production and made it a mainstay of their economy. There are other tribes like the Codie, who come from La Sierra de Santa Marta, which is where the best cannabis in Colombia was grown at one time. The Codie see cannabis, they call it an orphan plant because it didn't originate in their territory. And it, because their territory straddles production areas and smuggling areas, they became a battleground for various different armed groups. And so the Codie, for many years, have associated cannabis with violence, with bloodshed, with disruption of their culture, with displacement. Now, in just the past couple of years, the Codie leadership, which is a deeply, deeply spiritual leadership, have been conducting a reassessment of their relationship with cannabis and thinking about embracing cannabis as something to make a part of their culture and a part of their economy. So I think that there are these kinds of conversations that now are going on all around the world. And they're certainly happening in Mexico, they're happening in Colombia, any place where you've seen this association of indigenous communities and the cannabis trade, which has been pretty widespread. So I think that that's something to pay attention to. You know, my advice to investors in general is to look for a cannabis market that has a wider distribution of players, that's not so concentrated, that's focused on creating a domestic market as well as an export market, and that's spreading the opportunity around to create a multi-layered industry that has small players, medium-sized players, large players in various different sectors of the supply chain. I think those ultimately are going to be the healthiest cannabis economies that we see.
Steve, if I could just add to that, and I think that's a really important point that you've made. Legalization in much of the rest of the world is not going to look the same way it did in the US. And even as the US has been at the vanguard of this, one of the things that's been really striking to me is we've looked at the way countries in Latin America and in Africa in particular are looking at legalization, is even though there tend to be small cohorts of activists who've been pushing this forward, generally, it has taken somebody well-placed in government in a position of power, who's respected both in the society at large as well as in government, to make the decision to gain some intelligence about what this opportunity could look like, and make the decision to advance this. And so because of that, the timeframes with which these decisions are being taken tend to be far more compressed than you've seen in the West, where you've had years of lobbying, legalization, advocacy to get this to happen. In Africa and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we're finding that it's taken one or two strategically placed people in government to say that they're going to put their backs into this, and within weeks, if not months, the ball gets rolling. Second, for all of the international stakeholders that see this tremendous global opportunity in cannabis, to Steve's point, it's absolutely critical that you think first about the opportunity that cannabis could represent within that domestic market. It is going to take quite a long time for these international markets to lay the foundational infrastructure in place for an efficient and elegant kind of import and export system, to reach some normalization of pricing, and for there to be some harmonization of standards of quality, testing, etc. Until that happens, you don't want to be in a position where you've set up 400 growers, each producing thousands of hectares of capacity, awaiting a global marketplace that just isn't ready to absorb all that biomass, all that cannabis and its derivative products. So, one of the things that we've been counseling the stakeholders in Africa who are looking at this as an opportunity, just even using COVID as an illustration, which is dramatically straining healthcare systems. Can cannabis be used to offset some of the healthcare costs on your deeply strained systems by reducing your need to import prescription pharmaceuticals from around the world, to alleviate pain, to alleviate the side effects associated with some local tropical diseases? If that represents an opportunity, think about that in the context of activating your programs, even as you plan over the medium and long term to establish the sophistication, the technology, the infrastructure to enable you to supply international markets as they emerge.
And can you talk a little bit, John, about the landscape in Africa from an investment side? Everyone would know that Lesotho is probably the foremost country, but it's an export-only economy. Uganda, a little bit in South Africa, and now Zimbabwe. But, Africa should be a large consumption nation continent. How's the investments look there? Because it seems unsafe.
It's been a challenging market. Now, just on the demand side, we estimate that consumers in Africa are spending nearly $40 billion a year on cannabis. It's a large demand market, but it's also a large population market. You've got well over 1 billion people on the continent. A few standout kind of dynamics on the continent. South Africa, I thought, was a particularly interesting market because it was one of 3 countries in the world where full legalization has come about because their Supreme Court ruled that cannabis prohibition violated South Africans' human rights. That's an extraordinary development to see on the continent. And we think that it's actually raised the question in other countries whether if you finding kind of legislative challenges getting legalization reform adopted, can this be something that you can challenge in the courts? But there's a huge delta between making the switch or flipping the switch to saying it's legal now and having regulations that facilitate an efficient market, and then 2, having a consumer base, whether domestically or internationally, where you can get those products into. So, for example, we're seeing in the medical market in Zimbabwe, even in Lesotho, where they're facing a small country that had banked quite heavily on the international export opportunity. They were very quickly able to get investors who were interested in this idea of a low-cost production market in. But their target markets, again, Germany, Australia, in particular, remain far off where they thought the export opportunity was going to be. So the pace at which they've been able to achieve the economic development that they had anticipated, I think, has been far slower than had been hoped. We're seeing a lot of interest in industrial hemp, particularly for domestic applications. Ghana became the latest country to legalize industrial hemp, partly for CBD, partly for its agricultural and other applied material applications. And we think in light of the global dynamics right now, there's a very strong case to be made for industrial hemp on the continent for sustainability reasons, for crop diversity, and for the type of innovation that can be born from a low-tech sense using industrial hemp. But to Codie's introductory point, we don't disagree that the risk is high for stakeholders who are approaching this thinking that you'll be able to earn North American returns in these developing markets. If a gram is selling for $7 to $10 in Canada and in the US, and is selling for less than 50 cents in the sub-Saharan regions of the continent, the economics are vastly different. And if you scale your opportunity accordingly, there's a lot of opportunity here because the demand is there. But be realistic about the markets that you're getting into, both in terms of the local capacity to consume, as well as the local spending power for the products that might be produced. And then in shaping the regulations, this idea of setting up legalization just for export, we would caution against, because the export-only markets are going to face a long growth curve as the larger Western markets, European markets in particular, get up and running.
And I guess I've got time probably for one more question. Steve, as we're coming, I guess, out of COVID, I don't know if we're coming out yet. We seem to be in Israel, we're going back into isolation. What sort of opportunity does this present globally for cannabis as we evolve out of it? And then, John, maybe some numbers around what that could mean for countries as they legalize.
Well, fortunately in California, my home state, cannabis was declared an essential product during the COVID restrictions. And so while many other businesses have been forced to close, Harborside and every other licensed cannabis business in California and many other states has been able to stay open. And I think that that's in recognition of the wellness function that cannabis provides. So, at a time when it's very, very important to keep hospital beds, doctors' offices, clinics open for people who are dealing with COVID-related issues, the efficacy of cannabis as a first-line defense against many, many, many different medical conditions that would otherwise send people into those facilities is really striking. And you think about people who are dealing with the whole range of things that cannabis is effective for, all the chronic pain and seizure, et cetera, where we're talking about reducing a significant load on the medical system. So I think, we were talking about Zimbabwe and Africa, John, and reducing the load on existing medical systems so they can focus more on crises like COVID. I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is that cannabis turns out to be very, very effective for many of the stress and mental health issues that are raised for people, for all of us around the world that are going through the COVID crisis right now. And, we've seen already in places like Russia, where there's less access to legal cannabis, there's no access. They've had horrible problems with alcohol consumption spiking, and related to the alcohol spike, domestic violence spiking as well. So in the United States, we've seen a spike in fentanyl overdoses. And I think that all of this highlights the role of cannabis as a safe and effective mental health and wellness aid. So hopefully we see countries around the world really recognizing cannabis as a benefit on those inherent bases. What I have some concern about is that there's going to be a rush by governments to adopt legal cannabis as a source of tax revenue. And what we've seen in California and many other places around the world is that because there is a global, parallel, robust underground economy for cannabis, when jurisdictions overregulate and overtax the legal market, it all it does really is serve to rejuvenate the underground unregulated market. That's exactly what's happened here in California. So my caution to activists, investors, entrepreneurs around the world would be, yes, talk about all of the inherent ways that cannabis can help us deal with COVID, is helping us deal with COVID. But I discourage our community from making big promises about the amount of tax revenue that can be brought in by cannabis, because the reality is that the existence of the underground market really constrains our ability to do that.
John, any comments on the numbers around that?
Sure, and we'll use maybe Europe as an illustration of this. Nearly 40% of Europeans suffer from a condition for which cannabis is commonly prescribed in the US, and with nearly 20% of those being Europeans who suffer from back and neck pain alone. Now given that we know from both our research in both North America and in Europe, and you can find all of this at newfrontierdata.com/Arcview, we know that the primary reasons why consumers use cannabis: pain, stress release, managing anxiety, improving sleep outcomes. So help falling asleep, help staying asleep. To Steve's point, once you leaving pain out alone, and pain is, I think, one of the lowest hanging applications, which can dramatically ease stresses on healthcare systems, as well as reduce risks of opioid dependency, as we've seen at catastrophic rates in the US. But for anxiety, stress, and improving sleep outcomes, this pandemic has led to the most acute crisis that we've seen in public health and mental health in terms of stress, anxiety, and sleep disruptions, people having trouble falling asleep. And we think that creates just a phenomenal opportunity for the industry to present itself as a alternative to the pharmaceutical approach to managing these conditions, given all of the attendant side effects that we see with these. And so, while we completely agree that the hypertaxation of cannabis is actually one of the reasons why you've seen underperformance in many legal markets, you tax too high and it creates a phenomenal window for the unregulated market to thrive. Taxation notwithstanding, the investment into cannabis, in terms of cannabis being a job creator and a spurrier of new investment, and because most cannabis spending tends to be hyperlocal, this idea that you have a much larger multiplier effect with cannabis within the local economies where these industries are activated. means that we think that going into what is looking increasingly to be quite an acute economic downturn globally, that there's going to be a lot more serious stakeholders in economies around the world who will be wondering or considering cannabis as a potential catalyst for new growth, for attracting new investment. And we would just urge that you have a clear kind of view into some of the challenges the industry is going to have being activated. The long-term demand is absolutely there. The medical applications are robust and increasingly affirmed by the science. But this is a startup industry in a startup global environment. It's going to take some time to lay this track work. So avoid the bullishness that we saw in Canada post-legalization. We would call it irrational exuberance. But plan for where this industry is going. And I think as long as there's a realism in terms of the opportunity this industry represents, that there'll be huge opportunity to establish functional markets in a lot of these economies that serve both local interests, but increasingly form the foundation of a truly global cannabis economy.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think Lewis is going to hand over to him for Q&A from, I see lots of questions, but I appreciate the insights. Thank you very much. You know, I think I'd just like to add at the end, I am bullish still on cannabis. This is the best time to invest in an emerging industry in, you know, what, as you said, is acute global financial crisis, but the ability for job creation, for innovation, and for getting medicine to people who absolutely need it, there's never been a better time. So Lewis, over to you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, Saul. And thank you, John and Steve as well for this great conversation. I've gotten a lot of comments already that people are finding this a really insightful and educational conversation. Thank you so much for bringing this topic to light. But the conversation isn't quite over yet. Audience members, we do have, this is now a Q&A period that we have set up for you here. Unfortunately, we're not able to get to all of your questions. More than 20 of them have come in, and there's more than 200 of you on the call. But I've cherry-picked a couple just to wrap things up here with audience Q&A, and then we'll also move on to Jake's sponsor corner after this as well. So this is a question that I'm sort of going to paraphrase and merge from Ann Allworth, Mitchell Prywis, and Kate Mitchell. They all sort of touched around a similar topic. In this conversation that we had earlier, we talked about the pharmaceuticalization of cannabis, or it being more of a wellness product. Do you see a place for a wellness or nutraceutical product for cannabis in the future, whether that's for THC, CBD, or the other 100+ cannabinoids? Or is pharmaceuticalization and getting cannabis only with a doctor's prescription and not just a recommendation inevitable? Or is there room for both, and even an adult use market over the long term internationally? This is a question for everyone on the panel. And if we have time, we'll go for one more. But Saul, why don't we start with you, and then John, and then Steve?
Sure. I think both have to exist. A pharmaceuticalization for those that want a single molecule, or a study that proves that it does what it says it does and contains the amount that it says it contains. Whether that's the best product, I don't know. We'll see over time. But I think that Steve's right. This is a whole plant opportunity. And to make it a single molecule or a few ensemble molecules to try and get the entourage effect is missing the essence of this plant. And I think that's a mistake. But I do think that both markets will exist because both consumers exist.
John, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree as well. And for a couple of reasons. One, particularly given the safety profile of cannabis to date, we continue to search for any evidence that cannabis has killed anyone in a material sense. Just that has not been affirmed yet by science. So, in the context that cannabis in its whole plant form remains a really robust, broadly safe product to use, we think that the kind of rejection of this idea of the whole plant and its derivative products, even though we may not fully understand them, kind of being shut out of this emerging ecosystem, to me, I don't think is one that's going to be accepted by consumers. And two, I don't think is one that is founded based on our experience given the millennia that humans have been consuming it in its whole plant form. We think that there's huge opportunity. We have barely scratched the tip of the iceberg in both understanding the molecules within cannabis and understanding how to capture them and deploy them in ways that enhance human wellness. But I think we should not underestimate the continued value of the entourage effect of the whole plant extract and benefit that it can provide. Different countries are going to try and approach this differently, but to Steve's earlier point, the more you exclude it in the form which most consumers are most familiar with, the more challenge you're going to have constraining the unregulated market. And I don't think that's an outcome that many governments want as they expand the opportunities for this industry. So we think there's an opportunity for both, and we hope that, and we fully expect that opportunity will grow over time.
Steve, I think I know what you're going to say, but what do you think? Medical or pharmaceutical, wellness, and adult use, can all three play nicely together internationally?
Well, I think that we have to move towards that goal. In my experience, 95% of cannabis consumers, for whatever purpose they're consuming cannabis, can be served most effectively and most affordably with a whole plant preparation. I think that there is a role for pharmaceutical development. It might be that there are some few cannabinoids that need to be pulled out and combined with very specific terpenes that would be very difficult, even with smart breeding techniques, to achieve in a whole plant format. Those preparations may need to be combined with unique delivery vehicles that come from outside the cannabis plant. So I think there is some role for pharmaceutical development, but I think that role has been vastly overrated. And I think that the direction that Europe is moving in is the wrong direction, because it ultimately is going to cost those public health systems vastly more money with vastly lower effective rates to adopt pharmaceutical cannabis than whole plant cannabis. And just to give you a little picture of this, I talked to the first woman in Chile who was granted the right to use cannabis medically. She had to buy it from a certain international cannabis company, and the price was 7,000 euros for a 3-month supply. Now, I sold essentially the same product, which was a CBD extract in a alcohol spray bottle format, for about $40 for a jar. It would be really, really difficult to spend more than $400 or $800 on a 3-month supply for something that's just as effective. So I think that it's very, very important that we preserve the whole plant format for cannabis and not allow powerful corporations to rig the regulatory system to keep the most effective and most affordable variety of cannabis out of consumers' hands.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve, John, Saul. Great responses there. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions. But audience members, in the survey, we will be asking a question if you'd like to connect with the panelists and the presenters today. So be sure to check that out at the end of the call. But thank you again for your great insights and the lovely conversation that we had here today. Next up, we'll be bringing up Jake Kuzrak, our VP of Business Development, for Jake's Sponsors Corner. And he'll be speaking with Corey Koffler, a co-founder and COO of Green Tank Technologies. So again, thank you so much, Jake and Corey, over to you.
Absolutely, and obviously thanks to all our great panelists today. Very excited. I thought that was one of the best conversations we've had yet. Corey, a pleasure to have you on today, and I know we'll be seeing a lot more Green Tank in the weeks to come. Can you provide us with a breakdown of what kind of products Green Tank manufactures and a little bit of history on the brand? Oh, you're muted. There we go.
Sorry about that. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Obviously, a little background on Green Tank. We manufacture high quality vape hardware for the cannabis industry. We work with over 200 brands across North America. We launched the company about 4 years ago. Since then, we've raised over $20 million from strategic investors, which has really helped us fuel our growth. Our team has grown to 45 people in offices in Toronto, Los Angeles, and Shenzhen. And we recently launched our state-of-the-art facility for R&D and product development in our device lab in Toronto.
We were big because we had a couple offices. Well, hardware is obviously one of the most competitive spaces within cannabis. How does Green Tank stand out, and why are you a market leader? I mean, the talent on this team is clearly stacked.
Yeah, so I mean, talent's always been a big part of the equation for us. We continue to hire some of the brightest minds in the field of product development, research and development, and material science. We continue to invest heavily in those three pillars, as referenced with our device labs in Toronto. We stand out really by our unrivaled attention to product detail, quality control, and safety and design. We have a full team of 15 people, part of the Green Tank family in China that monitor every aspect of our supply chain and the bill of material, procurement, assembly, and shipping out each of our customers' orders. This guarantees really that each of our customers their products are made to spec consistently, reliably, and using the materials that we deem safe, both from a Green Tank perspective and with our factory partners, and ensuring that all the product certifications are in place. We also offer state-of-the-art customization capabilities that separate us from the rest, allowing our customers to create vape hardware that truly stands out in a very crowded market. As I'm sure you guys see with the data, the vape category is a very fast emerging product category within the cannabis industry. And we're seeing more and more brands enter the space. So, where other popular vape manufacturers offer a range of vanilla cartridge options, we encourage our customers to challenge us with their vape designs and their wishes, and we're able to work with them towards bringing their brand to life.
Got it. And what can our community do to really help Green Tank grow? Are you looking for clients, board members, investors, advisors? What can we do?
For us, we're always looking for customers. So, if there are vape brands out there looking to launch new product lines, or just cannabis brands looking to enter into the vape space, I would encourage you to reach out to us. On the flip side, we're continuing to grow our team. We're always looking for great talent. There's active roles out right now on the sales side as we continue to grow our footprint both in Canada and the United States, as well as on our product development team. So different engineering roles to work again in our device labs in Toronto, as well as our new labs that we're opening shortly in the United States.
Sure. Love to see people hiring, obviously, during times like this. Well, Green Tank counts notable firms like Casa Verde amongst its strategic investors. I gotta ask, are you working on a signature hardware line for Snoop? How about any other athletes or entertainers? I'm just curious.
Unfortunately, I can't get into the specifics of some of the vape lines we're working on, but we are working with a few different high-profile celebrities that most of you on the call would know. We're looking to launch some of these lines towards the end of the year. But as vape is a leading product category, you do see a shift of a lot of brands focusing on vape hardware, and it's a way for some of these celebrities to differentiate themselves when they want to enter the cannabis industry. So there are going to be a lot, I would say, of high profile celebrity vape brands that are powered by Green Tank hardware.
I'll be waiting with bated breath. Well, clearly you're innovators in the space, and I don't want to jump the gun before the official press release comes out or anything. But can you share a little bit about any of the new developments, any key partners, any new tech that you're spinning up?
Our focus is really on product development. I mean, I think that's where we separate ourselves from our competitors in the space. The device lab that we've built is a good example of that. It allows us to focus on the development aspect, control that process, do it all in-house from an R&D perspective, and really accelerate the ability to get a product to market from conception to to mass production. Just having the tools and resources in our device labs at HQ allows us to be nimble and move quick. So we have some great products that we're launching towards the end of the year that we believe are game changing for the vape industry in general, specifically on the cannabis side. Again, can't get into too much detail around those, but we are excited to get them out there, and I think it's something the market needs. A lot of the attention right now is just on form factor, disposables, cartridges, closed loop systems. Those are predominantly what you see in the market today. We're working on some really great technology around the heating elements, material sciences, and ways to create just a much safer and better user experience.
I love it. And obviously, it was great to have you guys sponsor State of Legal Cannabis Markets 8th edition. I know there's a segment of covering you guys in there for anybody who hasn't seen it yet. Final question here, though, the most important. What is the best way to get in touch with you? And do you have any offers you're currently running? I think Codie mentioned something.
Yeah, of course. So we put an offer together for everyone who's viewing today or listening today. So, we're more than happy to offer a 10% discount to all first-time customers of Green Tank. I guess the best way to reach out to us would be our sales@greentanktech email address. Just let us know you are a listener or a viewer of this webinar, and we'll be more than happy to work with you on bringing a vape brand to life and applying a 10% discount to that for being part of this webinar today.
Well, that's definitely generous. Corey, we can't thank you enough for that offer. And just as a reminder, we dropped the link into the chat below. So 10% off first order, not too bad. So of course, sales@greentanktech.com is what you need. And Corey, once again, thank you so much for making time to join us today.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thank you for having us. And it was a great panelist. So kudos to the gentlemen who were on before. And we look forward to being part of more events with you guys.
Sounds good. Looking forward to the next couple of weeks. All right. Well, to close things out, a couple key things that you need to be on your radar. Okay. First one, a survey popped up when we were talking today. We'd love to hear your thoughts about today's webinar and learn about some of the more important topics that we can bring to you as part of season 2. So be involved in the conversation, share your info, please. For Arcview group members, please join us in the after party immediately following this webinar. I know you received an email to register. It came from Troy Dayton, our Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder. So you'll jump off this link, pop in via the other one we provided upon registration. Now, arcviewaccess.com, if you don't know already, is where we hold all of our events. Everything is listed there. The recordings are listed there. Even the little bits of content, like what BDSA produced around our food and bev panel. You can find that there if you want to dig into the research and the document altogether. Now, Arcview Access is more than just that. You can head there for our new Discovery and WIN memberships. WIN, of course, is our Women in Cannabis Networking Association. Arcviewgroup.com WIN, best way to find out about that, regardless of your gender. There is a wholly new thing we're releasing called Cannabis Investing First Base. What is it? A 4-part program as part of our education series to really help those new to the industry navigate, what this thing is, what cannabis is, cannabis investment is. So I'm sure sales@arcview.com can get you set up with what you need, but you can find out more, of course, on Arcview Access. There are events coming up. So mark your calendars now if it's not open already. Tomorrow, we're doing another one of these. It's actually our July 16th Arcview Explores virtual tour. So I'm sure some of you caught the CannaSafe one we did last week. These are free for members, $25 until tomorrow for non-members, $50, of course, after that tomorrow. But this next virtual tour we're doing is with 1906 New Highs, Nuka Foods. These guys, they produce single strain cannabis edibles. Friday, July 24th, so next week, we actually have a special live 2-part series here, which is basically what we're calling Cannabis Can Heal, moving towards a more equitable industry. So of course, this is our panel. Could it be more timely, around racial justice within cannabis? Who's going to be on for it? Well, we got everybody from Steve Hawkins of the NPP, Rashid Koja of MCBA, and of course, Greenbridge Law. Shanita Penny of Budding Solutions. She's also a big lobbyist in DC. And then in part 2, it's a 2-parter, where you have Chanda Macias of Women Grow, Karim Webb of Fourth Movement, and our very own David Abernathy, VP of Research and Consulting, in addition to some other special guests. So make sure you tune in for that one. And catch our CEO, Kim Kovacs, in front of Founder Institutes and their global network on July 23rd. ArcviewAccess.com has the details. That's at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, PST, if you can join. And to close things out, Arcview Access Special Edition, the release of our Hemp in China report. Coming up August 5th, August 26th. Yeah, August is hemp month if you haven't heard already. We're doing a global hemp day with Canatech. And for members and guests only, obviously on Wednesday, July 22nd, that is another one of our Arcview Access Elite. So if you're a member, you have an invited guest you'd like to bring along, these are the final pitch showcases of season 1. The last chance to catch some top companies pitching, of course, for potential investment until we take a little break during October. All right, August. Now, live and in person. Yep, Arcview's doing live events. I know it's crazy, but we're going to be in the Hamptons, Sagaponic, Saturday, August 16th, or Sunday, August 16th, I believe, actually, from 1 to 4 p.m. There's book signing. There's a tequila sponsor. If you're in the New York area or if you can fly there, I'm sure we all miss networking in person. So give this one a shot. The Hampton Soiree is the place to be. There are, of course, additional ways to stay connected with the Arcview community. Join the Arcview LinkedIn Lounge, where our community stays connected, shares information and insights. Arcview's market research, already mentioned it, but is the #1 cited research across the legal cannabis industry. And we just released our 8th edition, State of Legal Cannabis Markets. Visit Arcview Access for more information on all of this. And of course, members, I will see you at the after party. Thanks again for joining today, everyone. This has just been a phenomenal panel. The caliber of content we have week after week continues to blow me away. All right. Well, we're going to pop up the survey, and then I think we have one final message. Thanks again for tuning in.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. My name is Cesar Gutierrez. I am from Colombia. We represent clients in the cannabis industry. We are an M&A boutique focused on the Latin American market, and we've been working on the industry maybe for the last 3 years now. So I love working with Arcview because you guys always have shown interest in any initiative that we have had. So you are always ready to help. You're always ready to find different ways and innovative ways and see if you can help in any way. So I think that's highly valuable from our side, and we expect to keep collaborating